So let me begin by saying a thing or two about Hugh Padgham. Hugh Padgham has either engineered and or produced or mixed three of my favorite albums from my favorite band, Drums and Wires, Black Sea, and English Settlement from the band XTC. And while I could literally talk about those albums for hours individually, diving into each one of them with all the reckless enthusiasm of a giddy little schoolgirl, I realize that Hugh Padgham has also been involved in a few other records too, many of which you might have heard of. Like that time he produced and engineered Synchronicity by The Police, or the time he produced and engineered In the Air Tonight by Phil Collins, or any of his other solo records, or that time he produced three of the biggest selling albums by Genesis, or Paul McCartney, or David Bowie, or Peter Gabriel, or Elton John, or Yes, or any of those good-selling solo records from Sting. And that's not even scratching the surface of what Hugh Padgham has accomplished during his career. Hugh Padgham is seen as a brilliant pioneer, creating the gated reverb technique of recorded drums that was used continuously throughout the 1980s. There's millions in sales, the 5 Grammy Awards, and the global recognition of being one of the greatest producers and engineers over the last 50 years. He also owns an independent jazz label called Gearbox Records. This is my conversation with the brilliant Hugh Padgham on Baxy's Musical Podcast.
It's Baxy's Musical Podcast.
I have to say it's a pleasure to talk to you. I actually looked at the Hugh Padgham discography, and I realized there's like 41 different albums that you've worked on that I own. So in one
Wow.
in one way, I may have helped you buy a car or put a child through college or something. So
The problem is it makes me feel so old.
well, me too, to be honest. Now we're talking albums that are 35, 40 years old, and some I still listen to. I mean, I'm a huge XTC fan. So it's one of the
Brilliant.
So it's one of the things that I love about your career, because so much of what came in that time kind of informed a lot of things that you would get involved in later on, and certainly I don't know if people really understand, and maybe you can address this. There is a big difference between being a producer and an engineer and a mixer. These are three very separate types of skill sets, and you happen to be one of the people out in the world who has all three.
Oh, well, you're very kind to say that. But I mean, I have XTC really to thank for my whole career. And I very much enjoyed listening to your podcast with Andy.
Oh, good. You heard it.
With Andy Partridge. Yes, I did. He's great.
I think I caught him on a really good day. He was wonderful. Absolutely wonderful.
That. But it was through working with XTC on Drums and Wires that I kind of got the job with Steve Lillywhite producing when I was still just engineering, with the Peter Gabriel's third solo album, and also through Andy and XTC touring with the Police. The story went that they were on tour in Australia or South America or somewhere,
right?
And on a bus, and Sting said, we need to find a new guy for our 4th album, and Andy recommended me, and so that's how I ended up doing the Ghost in the Machine album. So thank you very much, Andy Partridge. I've got a lot to thank you for. And it's nice because we keep up a bit as well.
You do.
So yeah, we do. We speak, and well, we obviously can't meet at the moment, but he doesn't live too far away from where I live as well. So
what's interesting with Andy when I spoke to him is, and I tried really not to focus on his issues with Todd Rundgren, but you've also heard other issues that he's had with other producers, and that I think what you have is a guy who is very clear in what he wants, and it doesn't always necessarily mesh with the producer that's been hired to fulfill that obligation. But I have to believe there's lots of times that as a producer, you're dealing with people that may not even really know what they want. They have their songs, or they have portions of their songs completed, and there's lots of pressure on an artist to get something accomplished, done, or replicate early
Well,
success.
I think if I have to sort of blow my own trumpet in any way, which I'm not very good at doing, um, I think I'm a bit like a sort of chameleon in a way, whereas I change my color and spots and stuff to suit the artist that I'm working with. And I think people like Todd Rundgren might be too kind of autocratic for people like Andy, whereas I would say that one of the most enjoyable records I made actually was with English Settlement, with
Mm.
with XTC, and I kind of like to think that I'm good at just sort of seeing what the band wants, where their vision is, and just going through with that vision so that there isn't this sort of push and pull sort of thing all the time. I mean, I I respect producers like Todd. Trevor Horn, for instance, who's an old friend of mine, he's what I call more of a sort of bossy type producer, where he almost became more well known than the acts that he worked with, and it's just a different way. You know, it's a different way, and sometimes it suits some people, and sometimes it doesn't. And I would say when I was working with the Police, they were almost in a way they were non-producible because they were so sort of uh, it was like a sort of this very small club, the three of them were, and they all had this sort of love-hate relationship, and you couldn't be bossy with them, and sometimes when they were fighting, literally sometimes fisticuffs in the studio, and I tried to sort of be Mr. Producer and pull them apart and come on, guys, and they just used to tell me to F off, you know.
I read Andy Summers' book. I think it was last summer, and he was talking about the relationship he had with Sting and with Stuart Copeland, and it sounds very much as you say. There had always been tension, and when you're talking about Ghost in the Machine and certainly Synchronicity, where I mean they're about to release the biggest album of their career. It seems to me like part of your job as a producer is also to be somewhat of a head coach or psychiatrist at the same time too.
I think so. I think a lot of the job is being a diplomat, really, and trying to sort of read situations, whether it be psychologically or musically. I mean, for instance, you might realize that someone's not in the right state of mind to sing a song at a particular time, and so you would sort of, or they haven't been singing very well, and you would nurture them into giving them more confidence, or just thinking, well, hang on, this is not the day to do it, let's do something else. So there's a lot of that. But like I said, with the Police, they it was a love-hate thing. I mean, there's only three of them, and they'd spent a lot of time together, had become very successful. There was envy around, and because Stuart thought that it was his band because he started it, and then obviously Sting ended up writing more of the hits, obviously. But I think at the end of the day, they did eventually regroup for a tour, didn't they? I mean, it was some time ago, probably 15 years ago now, but even then, we are talking about 40 years ago we were making those records nearly. Well, which is quite frightening. I was a young little boy then.
Well, so was I. I was a junior in high school, third year in high school when Synchronicity came out. It was one of those albums for us that was like, it was the biggest album, maybe of our high school career. It was like it meant a lot to people. So, when I hear about, stories about that band and about what went on, and then try to, put yourself in the shoes of like, there's two other guys in this band, and then there's Sting, and all the eyes are on Sting, but you've got two brilliant musicians backing him up. I mean, there's no question of Andy Summers and Stuart Copeland's
I
chops of
think
that band.
for me, some of the best bands have been three-piece bands because you do have to be extremely good at your job to be a three-piece jam. I mean, another English three-piece band that I absolutely adored was the Jam.
Mm.
And again, there was a sort of anger and tension in there. And I think with respect to Synchronicity, I think that tension within the members of the band really comes out on some of the songs on Synchronicity. But it's such a weird album for me because there's sort of well, I remember, good and bad times about it, and being thoroughly relieved when we'd finished making it, because it had taken a while, and with very much ups and downs in it during the making of it. And I was very proud of it, but pleased to be out of the studio, I think,
right.
as well.
Well,
but I kind of always remember my assistant after we mixed it in this studio in Canada. And he said, "Can I make my own copy of the record without Mother on it?"
when you hear a song that an artist presents, and in the case of the Police, Every Breath You Take is written. It's basically a very simple song, but when you hear it for the very first time, either as a producer or an engineer, whatever role you're serving, do you hear it in your head right away saying, "There's no doubt this is a hit," or do those moments still come as a complete surprise to you?
Well, the honest truth is that the first time I heard Every Breath You Take as a demo in a little London studio that Sting used to do his demos in, I knew that was a hit, but I could say that less than the fingers on one hand with the rest of my career.
Right.
I think I think it's a bit, sometimes a bit sort of presumptuous to think that you know a hit, because I've worked on some fantastic songs that have never even made the charts. So, but that song definitely stuck out. And I was in the studio listening to it with Miles Copeland, the manager, not the rest of the band, just Miles, myself, and I think Sting's roadie. And I always remember Miles looking at me and he said, "Hugh Padgham, that's a goddamn hit. And you better make sure you damn well make it one." So there you go. There was pressure on me right from the get-go on that song. And of course we had quite a lot of trouble making that song because Sting wanted a really simple drum part, and Stuart, bless his heart, always wanted to show off because he's such a great drummer, and he wanted to play something completely different. And in the end, the song ended up with the bass drum coming off a machine, and then him putting the other parts on separately. And many years later, when they were being inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, they wanted the band to play Every Breath You Take because it was the most famous song they did, and Stuart didn't want to play it because it wasn't going to show off his drums excellence well enough.
I think when you're in the Hall of Fame, I think by that point, most people are already aware of what you can do on the drums.
I would have thought so too, but there you go.
You talk about drums, though. There are certain drum patterns, certain drum moments that stick into everyone's heads. Everyone from, Jeff Porcaro's Rosanna Shuffle to John Bonham and Fool in the Rain. But it only takes like a simple thing to really make a career. And Phil Collins in the Air Tonight would be a perfect example of that. A simple drum fill that you were responsible for really turning into something magical. I mean, if anything defines Phil Collins' career, it was that song and that moment. In a way, you could maybe make the argument that without that drum fill, maybe Genesis doesn't have as many albums sold as a result of it. It was like a career-defining moment for Phil Collins.
Yes, it was. Yeah, we certainly never thought that was going to be a single in a million years.
But when you but when you create that effect on those drums and they come in as powerful as they do, and you're hearing it in the studio for the very first time, were people blown away by it? I mean, did you understand how special that was? Did even Phil understand how special that was at the time?
Um, well, there would only have been a few of us in the studio at the time, and I think the drum fill, I don't think he had thought about it particularly beforehand. He just thought we'd decided that we were going to shock the monkey, as Peter Gabriel said, shock the listener by having something come in that you weren't expecting. That was the whole idea, and so we discussed that we'd have the drums come in quite late. Also, not thinking that it would ever be a single, so it didn't matter that the drums didn't come in till 4 minutes or whenever it was, And yes, I mean, the sound was really kind of developed when I first met Phil during Peter Gabriel's third album, when we had this drum loop that he played live on the song called The Intruder, the first song on that album.
Yep.
So we knew about this big sound that we could get, and it was the same studio. It was the Townhouse in London, Studio 2, the Stone Room. That's where that sound was sort of, when we first developed it or heard it or invented it, or whatever word you want to say. And so we knew, and one of the big things about these drum sounds is that if you think about The Intruder, and in fact, the whole of Peter Gabriel's third album didn't have any cymbals or hi-hats on it, and nor does that drum fill on In the Air Tonight. The minute you put cymbals in there, because you're squashing the room with electronic compressors, the sound, you're squashing the sound so much. If you hit a cymbal, it just goes like a sort of explosion like that, and it wrecks the sound of the drums. So that's the one thing that if you ever did want cymbals on that sort of sound, you had to overdub them afterwards. But it was quite difficult to mix the song, to have the drums come in loud enough to be shocking at the end when you weren't expecting them, but you couldn't have the rest of the song so low
that it couldn't be heard. Right. Yeah.
It couldn't be heard. So there was quite a sort of difficult thing to get the whole, the whole thing right, all the way from mixing to even in the mastering studio. And of course, in those days, it was pre CD. So you had to make sure that the needle wasn't going to jump out of the grooves.
It seemed like almost everybody wanted to replicate that strong drum sound. I mean, there was an XTC documentary done a couple of years ago with a lot of time spent on Black Sea, talking about Terry Chambers and that drum sound and how everybody in the 80s wanted to replicate what you and Steve Lillywhite had done on Black Sea. And I wonder, did you guys make some sort of financial arrangement to make that happen?
Well, I wish we had. But again, Terry Chambers played the drums on Black Sea in the same room. It was all that room. And then, can you believe it? The Townhouse eventually tore that room down.
Really?
The 90s. Yeah. I mean, it had gone from being owned by Virgin Records to EMI. And I think even then it went on to Sanctuary, and they just decided one day that we want to have a bigger control room, and therefore, and I guess they thought maybe, I don't know, no one ever asked me. I just heard they'd torn the room down and made a big control room instead, and I went, "What? You crazy?"
Wow. So tell me about your. I know you've had a long friendship with Peter Gabriel, working on that one album, and then having him kind of help you get other work along with Phil and Genesis. But for people that may not realize how, and he may not even get the credit he deserves, how really innovative Peter Gabriel truly is. I mean, those early records, everything up to certainly to So, where he made, sold a lot of records, but those early ones, Three would be a perfect example. Those were all powerful records. And I don't know if people have ever really given Peter Gabriel the credit for the kind of genius he has.
Yeah, he is. He is a genius, and he's also one of the most likable human beings you could ever meet, and that's pretty rare in this business, I think. No, he's lovely, and I'm really honoured to know him, and we still have contact with each other as well, which is really nice. Although I've never worked on any of his other records at all.
Do you keep reminding him of that fact?
Well, yeah, maybe I should. I did one other thing with Peter, which was a song that he did with Yusu and Dor called "Shaking the Tree." Do you remember that?
I do
song?
remember that.
Yeah, so I worked on that, so that was fun. But anyway, it doesn't matter. Not many people worked on Peter Gabriel 3, and
Yeah.
I was one of them, and so it certainly helped my career. And Peter's still working as hard as he ever has done, which is brilliant.
Talk about artists you've only worked with one time, although you've worked on other projects for him, would be David Bowie and the Tonight record, which, if I'm not mistaken, that was the one he did right after Let's Dance. So that was a pretty important record for him. But tell me what it was like to work with David Bowie.
Well, I have to say it was a strange set of circumstances how I happened to work with David, and they were basically he was told by EMI that they wanted another record off him after the success of Let's Dance, and he had been on the road with it, and he famously doesn't really write on the road, and anyway, he came back, and Bob Clearmountain, who engineered Let's Dance with Nile Rodgers producing, was asked by David to do it. But Bob, I think, was working with, he used to do all Bruce Springsteen's stuff. And I think he was already booked to do a Springsteen record. So he said, look, I'm really sorry, I can't do it, but my friend, Hugh Padgham, would be perfect. And so somehow I got the call from my manager, but it was only engineering gig. But I thought, how can you possibly turn down working with David Bowie? And also it would be what we call in England a busman's holiday, where I wouldn't have the pressure of producing it as well. So I just thought this is going to be a most fantastic time, which it was for many reasons that I'll say in a second. But we got to the studio and David didn't really have many songs written at all. And if you look back on the credits on the record, there's quite a few covers and only 2 or 3 originals. But he had a young guy come in, produce it, called Derek Bramble. And the long and the short of it is that it didn't really work out with Derek producing. And so David asked me if I would finish off the record. So I've sort of got a co-production credit on it. But the thing is, it was too late. I think I would have been more assertive if I'd been involved right from the very beginning with the choice of the songs and stuff like that. And it had got to the period where David likes to work really fast, and we had sort of slightly agonized through the recording of the record. And I mean, if he could make a record in a couple of weeks, then that's what he would be, that would be his preference. And we were like, I don't know, 6 weeks in or something. We were also in the same studio that I did the mixing of Synchronicity, which was a studio in the middle of nowhere in Canada, and literally in the middle of nowhere. And I think David was bored because there was no nightlife, and all he wanted to do was finish the record. So I felt I was handed a poison chalice in a way. But saying that, David was such an unbelievably great guy. He's also, I think, probably the best singer I've ever worked with. When he sang, you're not talking about 5 takes or 10 takes or this, that, and the other. He would literally go in the studio and sing it either first time or second time
Wow.
perfectly. And I got on so well with him. It was, I'm just so honored to have known and worked with him, and it's so sad that he's not with us now.
Mm.
But I made also a lifelong friend of Carlos Alomar, and Robin Clark, his wife, who were on those sessions. They had played on Let's Dance, and so I look back on it with such fondness and respect for David. I did work a little bit with him on some Tin Machine stuff later on, a few years after that.
Right.
But
Right. Like on the second album. Yeah.
yes, it was definitely a real high point in my career. I mean, who doesn't want to work with the likes of Peter Gabriel and or David Bowie?
The one and only time I met David Bowie, he actually turned us down for an interview. And it was soul crushing. We were at a music festival in Milwaukee, and he was playing there that one night, and he was playing with Adrian Belew, the guitar player, brilliant
Yeah,
guy. And
yeah,
Adrian had just released a record, and David was involved in it. And me and my partner went up to him and says, "Hey, can we have 5 minutes of your time?" And he said, "Are you playing the new Adrian Belew record?" And we're like, "Well, no radio stations are playing that, but we love it, and we would love to talk to one or both of you." And he was incredibly polite about it. He was not a jerk, but he declined, and we were like, the two of us are walking, walking back and just feeling, oh God, we're just so dejected. We went so desperately to talk to David Bowie, but he was very kind about it. I have to say, even in rejecting us, I felt like, okay, well, at least he was nice about it.
yeah. Well, I mean, if you remember rightly, the when he was the Spiders, when he was Ziggy Stardust. That's it.
Right.
If you remember rightly, when he was Ziggy Stardust, and he basically fired the band at the end of the concert at the Hammersmith Odeon, the Spiders band, and none of them knew anything about it. Now that's a pretty vicious thing to do.
When you take on a project, and obviously, between early '80s to late '80s into the 1990s, I mean, you were like from one project to the next, several albums in a year. But when you're asked to do things now, what are you looking for to make that commitment? Is it the artists themselves, the demos you hear? I mean, what are you looking for?
Well, I think nowadays I'm not really looking to do that sort of thing anymore. Is the perfectly honest truth. I mean, that period of the 80s and working so much cost me my first marriage, because I was married to my job, not my wife. I was
Right.
just away the whole time, and so on and so forth. And I think, secondly, the scene has changed a lot now, massively, since the beginning of this century. And I think rock music, or whatever you want to call it, pop rock, or I've no idea what genre I'm sort of, involved in. But I don't think, I just don't think the scene is the same anymore. When we were making records back then, there were no computers, no computer games as such, really. And when I was a kid growing up, you either spent your pocket money on buying records, or going to the cinema, or going to the pub, or hopefully all three in a way. But it now, I don't know. I think it's why a lot of these 80s type, 70s, 80s, maybe 90s type bands and music is living on so well. I think there's a lot of fantastic music out there, but it's so much harder to find it now. I mean, my most of my involvement now is I am involved in a small jazz label called Gearbox Records. We're
Right.
based in England. We're very much involved in high quality sound, and we have contemporary jazz artists on our label, and we also re-release old tapes if we can find them from jazz people. And I always had an underlying love of jazz, whether it be, you know, the traditional names that we all know, Miles Davis, etc., Roland Kirk, blah blah blah. But also, I kind of secretly loved the jazz rock scene in the 70s and early 80s. You know, the Weather Reports or the Return to Forevers and
Right.
Chick Corea and Herbie Hancock and all those people. And so I'm involved as a not only as a producer engineer, but I also own a bit of the company and stuff. And so we make records in like a week at the most, three days recording, 2 days mixing, you know,
Wow.
5 days. That's a record. And it doesn't cost a fortune. You're not spending hours and hours, although I don't mean to be hypocritical because I said that David Bowie sang very fast, but normally doing vocals on a record is pretty time consuming, and getting the best out of it, because everything you're making on a record is for posterity. But with the jazz scene, number one, they're all fantastic musicians, although I was very lucky to work with all these bands in the 80s that were great musicians as well. But the jazz scene is a whole different thing. You're more or less just playing it live. And I really enjoy that because it keeps my hand in with listening and music, but it also keeps my chops on the case for engineering and stuff like that. That is mostly what I do now. So I hate to say that poor old Joe, my manager, I get asked to do this, that, and the other, and I usually reject them. But, you know, the scene is so different, not only how I described before, but if an American band wanted to work with me, I live in England, the cost of flying me out there and putting me up in a hotel, and I'm talking modestly now, would probably be more than their budget. So it in many ways, geographically, it makes it untenable. But saying that, you know, when I was working the other day with a record for our label Gearbox, there's so many less studios around now, but the studios that are around are quite busy. So there is stuff going on, which is great. It's not just all in the bedroom stuff.
Right. When you talk about the scene changing, and I have to believe that technology has been responsible for a good deal of that. People have more of an ability now to have a do-it-yourself approach to their own music, to not only recording it but also distributing it themselves. Where even record companies, you know, struggle to figure out where their role is and everything. I
Sure.
mean, and music has changed so dramatically as a result of the technology and the internet and sharing and MP3s. I mean, do you think that's been a part of it, and do you think that's been a negative?
I think it's a double-edged sword, actually, because I think what's fantastic is that you can buy a laptop, and you for very little money you can have software in your laptop that makes it into a recording studio. And so you can make your own record at home, and for very little money. And in the old days, you had to pretty well have a recording contract to be able to afford to go into the studio. So it's leveled the playing field a lot, which I think is fantastic. And because eventually I think the cream rises to the top.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the old days, it was much more of an exclusive sort of club to get a record deal and then be able to make a record in the studio. So from that point of view, I think it's great. From a negative point of view, I was talking to Carlos Alomar the other day, who I was talking about with David Bowie. And nowadays, if he gets asked to play guitar on something, he will be sent some files and he'll record his guitar on it at home and then send it back. the negative side of that, well, the positive side is you've got Carlos on your record or whatever, but the negative side is you haven't got Carlos's smile and laugh and beaming. You haven't. What I'm trying to say is you haven't got the vibe of the collective of people working together in the studio, and that I really miss a lot. I really do, and I think in the old days, before we even had computer automated consoles, it was like everybody in the band was helping to mix the record, you know, and you got all the faders and people, you know, it's that camaraderie and thing of all being together, which I think is missing now. But the one thing you can't change is change, and so you have to just, you know, you go along with it, and there's good stuff and not good stuff. But you know, to be honest, even when I was growing up, I didn't particularly like all the sort of sugar boppy type pop songs that were in the charts. All we wanted to wait for was the new Rolling Stones album or the new Beatles album or something. We hated, you know, loads of bands as well. So
Well, it could have been worse. You could have
what
been
can you say?
you could have been an XTC fan and have to wait, 10 years, 9 years, 15 years for new records and new material. That's one of the curses and the benefits of waiting and being patient with Andy Partridge and XTC.
Yes, that's true. It's such a shame that they sort of he and Colin sort of fell out, really, because I don't think there will be another XTC record. But I think in a way, I do think that XTC made some brilliant stuff after English Settlement, which was obviously the last one I made, but that was the last time they were a band as a band, if you see what I mean. Yeah. Terry went to live in Australia. He's back now, actually, but they didn't tour, obviously, after that. And so it was, their records were studio opuses, you know, which there is some amazing stuff as well.
The only other band that I really wanted to ask you about, because no one ever talks about them, and it's one of these bands where I thought they never got the credit I think they deserve, because I thought some of their songs are unbelievable, was Split Ends. And that's a band I know you work with a couple of times, and some of those records and the Finn brothers are such great songwriters, but just maybe too quirky for like a mainstream acceptance.
Yes, exactly. I mean, they were they really, to be honest, XTC and Split Ends are my favorite two sort of bands, especially if you do put them into the thing of great bands who never made it as well as they should have done. And obviously Neil Finn went on to have a lot of success with Crowded House. Yeah. But Tim, his elder brother, was very, very talented as well. And they were amazing. All of them great musicians again. Their songs, absolutely fantastic. Totally great guys, really enjoyable, but just had an awful lot of bad luck. I mean, we recorded a song called 6 Months in a Leaky Boat that came out exactly when England went to war with Argentina on the Falklands Islands, which you guys in America probably don't remember very much, but it meant our Navy sailing about 6 weeks over to there. So of course none of the radio stations would play it, and yet it was a great song.
But then you also worked on like a Message to My Girl from Conflicting Emotions, and I hear that song and I'm going, why is that not just a massive hit? It's every bit as beautiful as any other song they've maybe ever written. What a great ballad that was, and it didn't go anywhere, especially in the States, and I don't think it did very much in the UK either.
No. Again, it's one of those things where we started our conversation talking about, do you know it's a hit? And that was a classic one that it wasn't too difficult to think that is a hit. But if everything doesn't combine, the record company doesn't do its job, or whoever, publicity, this, that, and the other, Takes two to tango, I'm afraid.
It's a shame. They deserved better.
They
Well,
certainly did.
yeah. Yeah, I literally could talk to you all day because there's like 9 million other records I'd want to talk about. But I do appreciate your time today, Hugh. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
It's been a great pleasure talking to you too.
Thank you. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for inviting me onto your show. And I love it, by the way. And you've had some,
thank you.
I've listened to quite a few of your podcasts now, and you've had some amazing people on the show. I congratulate you on it. And,
Thank you.
May you have many good more people to come.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much, Hugh. Okay, that was pretty damn cool. Hope you enjoyed today's podcast. Please share it with everybody you know. I'd love to hear what you think, and you can always email me at bax@rock102.com. And thanks again for listening to Baxy's Musical Podcast.